The goal of the webinar this morning is to provide tourism employees information that they can use to easily answer visitor inquiries. The webinar will not focus on solutions or cause and effect, but you can reach out to the area experts we've assembled for information should it not be provided to you during this webinar. If you'd like to ask a question, you need to raise your hand and type in the question, and we hope to get to most of them at the end of each subject area. If we do not get to every question today, because we want to stay on time, we're already late, we will compile a list of answers to every question that's asked today and forward it out with our post-webinar survey. I want to just say good morning to Commissioner Frank Mann. He is the Tourist Development Council Chair, and he is joining us as well as his team from Lee County Natural Resources. They will be available for the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. The 4 subject areas that we will focus on today include Lake Okeechobee and freshwater releases, presented by Phil Flood, who's the outreach representative for South Florida Water Management District. Red tide and beach conditions system, presented by Dr. Tracy Fanera, staff scientist with Moat Marine Laboratory. Water and health advisories, presented by Jennifer Roth, epidemiologist with the Florida Health Department of Lee County. And finally, the algae, rackline, and beach management practices, which is a useful presentation for those of you that are working on the beach every day. And that's going to be presented by James Evans, who's the Director of Natural Resources for the City of Sanibel. So again, I would encourage you to listen to the presentation. You may have your questions answered. If you don't, at the end of each topic area, we will entertain a few questions, and then we will answer all the questions completely in writing and forward them back to you. So I'm going to turn it over to Phil Flood.
All righty. Well, thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about management of water in South Florida, and I want to start by just kind of talking about a little bit about how our system got developed. We start originally with pre-development, where we had a gravity-fed natural system that covered much of South Florida, and then today, post-development, we now have a managed system of pumps and canals that are in place to support the development as well as the environment. Our development efforts started when the state originally became a state, and the federal government turned over all of the swamplands to the state of Florida, but it came with a caveat that all these lands must be drained, and the purpose of that was so that the state could prosper, so that it could develop, and that these unusable wetlands could be developed. Developers came in and started working on trying to drain off our areas throughout the state. And then in 1905, the state of Florida actually created the Everglades Drainage District, whose purpose was, as the name implies, drain off the Everglades. And they constructed these major drainage canals throughout the South. They deepened the Caloosahatchee River, which in the late 1800s had been connected to Lake Okeechobee by Hamilton-Diston. And they also made a connection on the East Coast where they connected St. Lucie River to Stewart as well. These allowed development throughout the state. Here's a graphic of the West Coast, where we're promoting these drained soils, how you can come over here, come build and progress with us. We have these soils that have been drained. You can now farm on them. You can live on them. We've got this great transportation system on the river going over to Lake Okeechobee. And this was similar throughout the country at the beginning of the year there, trying to encourage development. In the 1947, the state was hit with a major hurricane that left much of South Florida underwater. The graphic on the bottom left, the blue, shows how much of the state was underwater, not just a couple inches, but several feet in places for weeks and months at a time. The state of Florida petitioned the federal government, along with all the residents over here, asking for assistance, asking for help to address the flood control problems that we had here. And what came out of that was a project known as the Central and Southern Florida Project. It was designed principally for flood control, but also had elements of water supply and navigation, protection of saltwater intrusion, and also to try to help protect fish and wildlife. It started with connecting all the lakes south of Lake Okeechobee together up north there, channelizing the Kissimmee River so we could focus water down into Lake Okeechobee. It expanded the Herbert Hoover Dike up to a 146-mile dike around the lake, which could then use to store water and release water south into the Everglades agricultural area, waters down to the East Coast for drinking water. It constructed a large levee from Lake Okeechobee all the way down to Florida Bay to keep the development on the East Coast intact. It put a berm around the Everglades agricultural area to protect them, and it took the remnant Everglades and constructed these water conservation areas to the south. It also included some additional drainage to move water along the East Coast, some conveyances to send more water out to the estuaries, and water control down to the south there. So this map pretty much shows a summary of everything that's occurred, starting back at the blue is in 1880s to 1930s, and then our more modern system is listed there in the red. That was part of the Central and Southern Florida project. The green boxes depict water quality treatment areas, stormwater treatment areas. Those are areas that are specifically developed to capture water, store it, treat it, and then move water to the south. So we went from that original slide I showed with a natural system to one now that's comprised of over 2,000 miles of canals, 2,000 miles of levee, over 1,200 miles of water control structures, massive pump stations where we can move water across the state and throughout the counties, 57,000 acres of treatment just for water quality. And Lake Okeechobee is a 450,000 acre area that's used to capture and store water, as is the nearly 1 million acres of water storage down in the water conservation area. All aspects of this system has specific regulation schedules on how to operate it, every one of the canals and the pumps. And the district operates this system in accordance with the regulation schedules and state permits. It's pretty efficient. It does a great job with flood control, but there are some challenges with trying to move waters to the south, trying to keep up with the development that's occurred out there. I'm not going to talk about all these, but one of the biggest challenges we have to deal with is the weather. Never knowing exactly how much rainfall is going to come and where it's going to come. Rainfall creates stormwater runoff, and runoff into Lake Okeechobee enters the lake up to 6 times faster than it can be released. So there's great concerns about monitoring weather patterns and knowing when to move water and where to send water. The Herbert Hoover Dike that surrounds the lake is in pretty bad condition. The Corps has conducted studies and has identified a large segment of it that needs to be rebuilt. They're actively working on trying to rehabilitate the dike. They have secured about 21 miles of it thus far, and they've got easily twice that much to continue to build on over the next decade. Lake Okeechobee, the water levels are actually managed by a regulation schedule that the Corps of Engineers is responsible for. The Corps likes to keep that water between 12.5 feet and 15.5 feet. Today, the lake is around 16 feet, and the concern is if it rises up to 18 feet, it's at risk of failure. So the LOR's regulation schedule is in itself a constraint on where water can go and how water can be utilized. Water quality is a big constraint. As a result of a federal lawsuit, the water that's entering Everglades National Park at the south end of the system has to be at 10 parts per billion of phosphorus or less. That's very challenging. Water enters the lake at about 152 parts per billion. It exits the agricultural area at around 122 parts per billion, and when it comes out of our stormwater treatment areas and the water conservation areas, it's down around 9 right now. So trying to get that water out of the lake and getting it into Everglades National Park, it has to all be cleaned, and therefore we have constraints in sending it through our treatment areas and our storage facilities. Another thing is when we have all this rainfall, all these areas are wet already. They're already saturated. The canals that convey water to the East Coast, they're already full with water. The water conservation areas are full. And when you have these big rain events and you're trying to move water to the south, if they're already full, you have various limitations on moving that. Another concern and constraint that we have deals with endangered species and protected species, particularly migratory birds and endangered birds. Our largest water conservation area 3A, moves water into Everglades National Park. Today, we're limited. We can only utilize 2 of the 4 conveyances in the Everglades National Park due to a nesting bird that occurs out there. So there are other constraints out here, but I'll let you look at those at another time. Let me talk a little bit about the rain event that we've experienced. Right now, we're in in an El Nino weather pattern, and what that has resulted in is a wetter than normal dry season. Our entire 16 county area, starting up in Orlando all the way down to the south, has seen an extensive amount of rainfall. Here on the southwest coast, in January, we usually get 2 inches of rainfall. We got over 11 inches of rainfall over here. And that water has to go somewhere. And that's the situation that we had throughout our entire watershed. To complicate matters, much of that rainfall came within a 3-day rain event. This graphic over here shows the levels of rain that came over those 3 days at the end of January. And you can see the areas around Lake Okeechobee. They received upwards of between 3 and 6 inches of rain over that 3-day period. As a result of that, all the canals and the drainage systems in and around the lake were overwhelmed. They exceeded their capacities for storage, and as well as being able to convey those waters to the south. As a result, the district ordered the back pumping of water from the southern end of the just south of the lake. This was areas comprised of the agricultural areas down there, including a number of local communities, South Bay, Belglade, and those areas over there. Back pumping used to be a common practice. It used to be part of the Central and Southern Flood Project, whereas you would back pump water into the lake for water supply purposes. Those practices were curtailed nearly a decade ago. Today, the only time that back pumping is allowed is for flood control purposes, and it's under specific conditions that are defined by a DEP permit. So this last rain event over here, we back pumped for 4 days, and it worked out to be the equivalent of 3/4 of an inch that was added onto the lake. The rain event itself provided approximately 10 inches of rainfall to the lake. So let me talk a little bit about the source of water that's coming into our estuary, and a little bit about our watershed here. Where exactly does the water come from? This graphic shows the last year, the water flow that made it into our estuary. The blue is water that comes from Lake Okeechobee. The gray and the green is water that comes from our watershed. Now, our watershed is pretty extensive. The Caloosahatchee River is approximately 70 miles in length from Lake Okeechobee out to Sanibel Island. The river drains an area about 1,700 square miles, parts of 4 counties. And so if you take a look at this graph over here over the last year, you can see during the last dry season, February through June, almost all of the water that came to the estuary came from Lake Okeechobee. Those were made specifically for environmental purposes, specifically to keep the estuary healthy, to try to get the salinity balance correct. As a result of the ditching and draining and development of our watershed, there's not sufficient water flow in there during the dry season. So the estuary relies upon Lake Okeechobee. When the rains come in the summertime, as you see in June through October, discharges from the lake were curtailed, and all of the water that came in is runoff from our watershed. Back in November, as a result of, it was still dry back then, lake releases picked up again, but then as the rainy season started kicking in, the Corps of Engineers dropped off the releases, and in January, we had that large rain event, and you can see the water level spike, and it was almost exclusively water that was runoff from within our watershed. Again, that watershed is from Lake Okeechobee to 70-mile area from Lake Okeechobee to the Gulf. That first week when the Corps made lake releases, approximately 12% of the water that was coming out into the estuary was actually coming from Lake Okeechobee. Despite all the media reports that said it was the lake releases, only about 12% of that was actually coming from Lake Okeechobee. Now, since that time, conditions have changed. The rains have tapered off. The runoff from our watershed has tapered off, and lake releases have increased. This graph right here shows what we've seen in the last 2 months. And last week, the weekly totals for lake releases versus basin runoff, 65% of the water was coming from Lake Okeechobee. So as you can see, with the lack of rainfall, we have less runoff from our own watershed. So today, the number is around 65% of the water is coming from Lake Okeechobee. So let's talk a little bit about some of the nutrients that are in our watershed and the water and in the water that's coming into our estuary. Our Caloosahatchee estuary is impaired for nitrogen. It's phosphorus in the Everglades. It's nitrogen over here on the west coast. So this graph right here shows where the water is coming from, where the nitrogen loading is coming from. And over the last 5 years, the water flow, a third of the water, approximately a third of the water comes from Lake Okeechobee, and about a third of the nitrogen comes from Lake Okeechobee. 69% of the runoff over the last 5 years has come from our watershed, and it contains 68% of the nitrogen loading. So you can look at this graph over here, and you can see the lion's share of that nutrient loading and the water is coming between Franklin Locks and Lake Okeechobee. Approximately 50% of the nutrient loading of the nitrogen is coming from that watershed. About 20% of it is coming from west of Franklin Locks, the more urbanized areas and some of the more agricultural areas in Lee County. So let's talk a little bit about the lake water and its sources. This graph will show you where the water comes from into Lake Okeechobee and also its nitrogen loads. And if you take a look at this graph, you'll see that 91% of the water in Lake Okeechobee comes from north of the lake, and it contains 87% of the nitrogen loads. There's a lot of discussion about all this water, the nutrient-rich water that comes from the south of the lake. Well, here you can take a look at the graph. The yellow depicts the water that comes from out of the EAA. And over the last 5 years, they contributed 3% of the water load, 3% of the water in Lake Okeechobee, and 6% of the nitrogen loading. That's the last 5 years, and that did include major rain events 2 years ago, and then about 4 years of somewhat more normal. So here you can see the actual source of the nitrogen that goes into Lake Okeechobee and where the water comes from. So let's talk a little bit about some of the solutions, some of the things that are going on out there. At the federal level, we have the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. This is a 50-50 partnership with the state of Florida and the federal government, and it includes approximately 70 large-scale projects to construct. Most of those are large-scale reservoirs and environmental restoration projects, and their purpose is to restore and improve the water quality, the timing, the distribution, and the flow of the water. It's all about getting the water right. And Everglades restoration is all about sustainability. It's all about making sure that there's going to be sufficient water to meet our environmental, our agricultural, and our urban needs. The clicker's not working now. Here we go. I apologize. At the state level, a big directive is what we call restoration strategies. Its focus primarily is on water quality. We get a lot of the storage and the habitat restoration through the Everglades restoration projects, but restoration strategies focuses on water quality. And it's building large-scale stormwater treatment areas. It involves building shallow reservoirs to capture and hold that water that will be used for treatment. Just here this past year, one of our largest projects came online. It's the A1 shallow water reservoir. 60,000 acre-feet of storage that's located immediately south of Lake Okeechobee. That just came online here in the last several months and is now operational. We have another 45,000 acre-feet of storage that's located southeast of Lake Okeechobee. That's the L8 shallow water reservoir. That one will be completed in January, and there's additional work going on to expand stormwater treatment area 1 west. This program right here is an 8-year program with an $880 million commitment. Another big activity that the district is involved in involves utilizing public and private lands for storage. We utilize some of these lands that are already in public ownership and others where we have specific contracts where we're paying ranchers and citrus growers to store water on their properties. We have 20 active contracts out there on storage on private lands. We have a new one that's coming online that's actually in works right now at Babcock Ranch, and one that came online about 1.5 years ago in Glades County. There's also about a dozen projects that are involved in private lands. This past year, we recently created additional storage out on a piece of property that we purchased with the partnership with Lee County, the Boma property, where we're doing some active storage out there. But we have projects located north of the lake as well as east and west of the lake where we're doing storage. And we've also worked with Lee County on doing a couple of projects on 2020 lands, one right here in Fort Myers that came online this year, the North 6 Mile Cypress project, which holds about 1,400 acre-feet of water. And then we also are doing some storage on some properties that the Lehigh Acres Municipal Services District is doing out there in Lehigh. Another big project that recently came online this year is the Nicodemus Slough project. It's located just west of Lake Okeechobee. It's 34,000 acre-feet of storage. It is actively being used right now. We pull water directly out of Lake Okeechobee and store it right out there. It's a public-private partnership. We pay Likes Brothers $2 million a year to utilize those lands and for them to operate the storage facility. The big project that's underway right now is the C43 Reservoir. It's part of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration project or plan. Its entire purpose is for environmental reasons. The idea is to capture high flows coming down the Caloosahatchee River, pull that water out, store it in the reservoir, and then during the dry season make those releases to provide essential water flows to the estuary during the dry season. This project was ready to go in 2008, where the land was acquired. It was purchased, designed, and permitted, and we were waiting the federal government to move forward. However, that didn't happen, but the governor last year directed the district to move forward with construction of it. This year, we awarded the first construction contract to build this reservoir. It's an above-ground reservoir that will be located on 10,500 acres. To give you an idea of the size of this thing, it's 6 miles wide, east and west, 6 miles. It's another 3 miles from north to south. We will be building a 25 to 35 foot tall dike all the way around it, and we'll store 15 to 25 feet of water. It is under construction right now. The first half of it will be constructed by the year 2020. So given the magnitude of it, it's a 4-year construction window. And I kind of wanted to close talking just a little bit about some of where our priorities are. We have over 40 active major restoration projects underway right now. These are projects where we've invested $1 million to sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars in each of these projects. They're actively underway. Our board is engaged in, and we are working on. We have land in place to do these projects. Some of them are in the planning stages. Most of them are under construction right now. Our priority is to get those projects finished, continue to look to the federal government, look to the legislature for funding to move those. Nearly all of these projects are focused on trying to clean that water and have the ability to move it south. And we always are looking for opportunities where we can store more water and looking at those public and private partnerships. So with that, there's kind of a quick overview of some of the issues and the situation that we have out there. And if we have some questions, I will try to answer these.
Thank you, Phil. Okay, we're going to...
We can always come back and do questions at the end as well. So if you'd like to move on. And
we are not seeing any questions right now. So if you have some, don't forget you need to raise your hand and type your question in so that we can see it. So right now we're going to turn the controls over to the next presenter. And that is Dr. Tracy Fanara with Moat Marine Laboratories. And the focus of her presentation is going to be red tides and the beach condition systems that we manage here in Lee County.
Hi, my name is Dr. Tracy Fanara. I'm with Moat Marine Laboratory. I'm the program manager for environmental health. Our goal at Moat in environmental health is to research interactions between humans and the environment to protect public health, natural resources, and the economy. We want to look at how human activities impact the ecosystem, and also how environmental conditions impact human health. In addition, we have a big focus on public outreach and education. So many of you have heard of red tide, especially this year, and red tide is responsible for wildlife fatalities, fishery closings, and equates approximately $23 to $84 million per year lost in Florida economy and tourism. And there is a picture of a red tide Carenia brevis cell in the bottom right. Carenia brevis in large concentrations constitutes a bloom, and you hear the term red tide bloom a lot, and they contain a toxin called brevetoxin. and it's responsible for fish kills, as you can see up at the top. Respiratory effects, because these toxins can be aerosolized when cells lyse or are aggregated or die. That toxin can be released and aerosolized by sea salt particles and come on shore and cause people to cough or sneeze, itchy nose, eyes. It's responsible for contaminated shellfish poisoning. So if you eat shellfish within a certain amount of time after a red tide bloom, you can get sick. And it's responsible for deaths of wildlife. So the effects that you might see from brevetoxin is neurotoxic shellfish poisoning if you consume the toxin, or respiratory irritation if you breathe in particles with the toxin. There have been some reports of dermal irritation from swimming within red tides, but they are more rare. Where it gets serious is with individuals with COPD, asthma, lung cancer that come onto the beach and experience this respiratory irritation. This is some satellite imagery from this past bloom this year. We had one bloom on the Panhandle and another on the southwest Gulf Coast. The causes of red tides are a recipe which we have not fully established. It's a complex, it constitutes complex biological interactions, physical conditions such as tides, currents, density boundaries, and nutrients. They've been occurring since the 1700s, and we have research that suggests that blooms start offshore on the ocean bottom, and that nutrient loads may contribute to sustaining a bloom. However, we do not have research saying that nutrients can initiate a bloom. So this is just a visual of the life cycle of Karenia brevis, or what we know of it, and the nutrient sources for Florida red tide. So at MOAT, our research efforts constitute monitoring, research, and public education and outreach. We have collaborations with NOAA, FWC, GCOOS, city, state, county governments, USF, New College, University of Miami, and soon-to-be University of Florida. So we have an integrated research team at Marine Laboratory consisting of phytoplankton ecology, ocean technology, ecotoxicology, chemical and physical ecology, and environmental health. And we all work together on red tide to come up with answers for the public and dissemination of that information. This is a slide just showing our combined effort with FWC, FWRI. We are responsible for monitoring, laboratory, and field experiments. We have gliders, which are robots, basically, that are in the ocean and take samples, then report back to us via computer. And we have improved the beach conditions reporting system. So this is just an example of our monitoring effort from 2012 to 2015. We had a coastal survey and an offshore survey. We collected samples for nutrients, toxins, pigments, and CTV. And this was the 2013 to 2015 effort, and those samples we shifted south. We have also looked at estuaries, and we have found that the red tides significantly correlate with riverine flows to Charlotte Harbor, but for duration, but that we have found no correlation between red tide duration with Caloosahatchee flows. This is an example of some of our red tide research that we do at Moat. Ecotoxicology of shellfish. We're looking into the life cycle of Perennia brevis, and aerosolized brevetoxin research, and water quality research. This is an example of a study that was done well before my time at Moat on C43 Beach, looking at asthma patients and brevetoxin and how the brevetoxin impacts asthma patients long term. And this is our education and outreach program. This is our joint Facebook page with SWC. Below that is just an example of the Art of Red Tide project that we have with Ringling School of Art to create media or material to disseminate to the public. It gets the students involved and educates them at the same time. So the beach conditions reporting system reports from 27 beaches along the Gulf. The reports are made by trained beach sentinels. The main focus is to alert the public of red tide, but if you look at the red tide reports, it never says, or if you look at the beach conditions reporting system, it never says red tide specifically, and that's because the human effects of red tide are there's a lot of details that go into it. Blooms are patchy, and depending on wind conditions and current conditions, you may experience some of those effects and you may not. There might be a bloom offshore and no respiratory irritation. So just to clarify and really educate the public, it's just easier for us to show dead fish and respiratory irritation, which are two effects of red tide. The information is disseminated through a website. It's visitbeaches.org, and the data is used for outreach and research. So we just redeveloped the BCRS, and it was launched in November. Our goals were to make it really easy to use, mobile phone optimized, able to upload photos, and we wanted it really to be the first stop before anybody goes and visits a Florida beach. So we sent out a survey to visitors internally and to stakeholders to see what they would want to see on a beach conditions report. And this is what it looks like now. And this is an example report from CSCT. So these are the new parameters that are now reported. We added quite a few parameters because people, when there's not a red tide, we still want people to come to this website to form a habit of coming here before they go to the beach. So we added things like crowds, debris on the beach, surf conditions, amenities, pictures, and coming soon there'll be sunset and sunrise. Yeah, so this is our reporting app. So not only did we make it easier for the user, we made it easier to report. So there was less likely false reports or accidental misinformation. So we made it very simple so the reporters just select picture. So the future of the BCRS includes expanding geographically and scientifically, and we really hope to get a citizen science application out this year where citizens on the beach can report red tide effects or any kind of beach conditions that they see, so that that 27 beaches that you saw, all the spaces will be filled by reports from any citizen that's visiting a beach. It will be geolocated so that their position is reported as well as what they have to say. So these are just some examples of the current projects that we're working on within the red tide umbrella. And we're working with NASA on using the beach conditions reporting system to test microscopes on cell phones to detect red tide. We're working with USF on It's a handheld Carenia brevis detector that uses RNA sequencing. And then, of course, we're expanding upon our Red Tide co-op with FWC, and our integrated ocean observing system with GCOOS, and continuing environmental health outreach. So these are, along with the BCRS, these are other sources of information that you go to get a full picture of what's happening at the beach, what's happening with red tide, and it's really important that you come to these websites and check it so you can make the healthiest decision possible before going to the beach. Really, we created the beach conditions reporting system to protect tourism and public health, so that when someone has a first experience at a beach, it's not a bad one, and they don't leave thinking that that beach is like that all the time. We want to tell them in advance so that they can go to a beach that is not experiencing those red tide effects, and then return to that beach that they were looking at in the first place when those effects have passed.
Okay, so thank you, Tracy. The VCB does get questions. For instance, there's visitors that will come planning a vacation, and there will be someone in their family with asthma. And we use the beach condition systems quite frequently to show them where they can go to see if their respiratory effects are happening at the beach they want to visit. And the good thing about it is they can choose another beach. So conditions change and are different at different locations, so it's a great resource that we enjoy referring people to. Okay, we're going to pick a couple questions because we've got quite a few. And one of them is, can I get a copy of the slides shown? And the full webinar, when we are done today, will be posted to the partner site, leavecb.com, and the post-webinar survey will direct you to that presentation. So you will be able to get a copy of the full presentation. Let's see, we will pick.
Does the red tide affect the stone crab fishery?
That is a really good question, and I can give you that information. I know it does affect shellfish such as clams and whelks, oysters, but I am not sure about stone crabs. So I can get that information to you. If you email me at tfanara@moat.org, I can get you that information today. I'll talk to our ecotopicology team.
So we see many questions. We might not get to them all, but we will answer them all. Again, post-webinar, we will have our topic experts reply to all of the questions that you've posed. There's another one a question for Mr. Flood oh, there it is.
Well, yeah, because they're putting new questions all the
Okay,
time,
so please expand on the storage strategies being used at Babcock and 6 Mile 2020 sites. Are we controlling drainage or using these areas to store water from other areas?
Well, there's a couple projects in the works at Babcock. One is a public-private partnership with the Kitson partners, where they are going to actually have a permit in place to build some facilities where they're going to be capturing water that would run off into the Caloosahatchee. They'll back that water up onto some of their pasture lands and hold that water there. It's a little over 1,400 acre-feet of storage, I believe, we'll get over there. There's also another project with the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services where they have got their permits, and they're looking to move forward with the construction of another dispersed storage on the Babcock Preserve, State Preserve lands right at the Four Corners area. Again, that one is a little over 1,500 acre-feet. There's a couple of projects that were done with the Lee County on 2020 lands, the Bob Janes Preserve. We partnered with them to pull down some of those berms and some of those ag fields where we're actually keeping the water on the property, holding it, getting the storage out there, keeping it from out of the river. I don't know the specific volumes on that, but the North 6 Mile Cypress project was one where they actually did construct some berms and an outflow outfall and trying to redirect the water flows south into 6 Mile Slough, whereas historically where the water used to go. And so that project is actually in place, and there's another phase of that will actually do some additional storage out there. So hopefully that answers some of those questions.
Okay, is there a concern long term that Southwest Florida will run out of quality drinking water similar to the Flint issue?
Well, drinking water, that's a completely different issue, but actually no. The Water Management District does a water supply plan. In fact, we're in the process of updating it right now. We look out 30 years in the future to identify the demand for water. And the last time we completed a plan was 5 years ago, and we found that based upon the projections, there will be sufficient water supply, provided that we continue with efforts to develop additional alternative water sources, such as pulling water out of the Floridan and cleaning that up, utilizing irrigation, reuse water for irrigation and conservation. Yeah, Lee County in particular has a very diverse water supply source. They pull water out of the Caloosahatchee River, and they also pull water out of some of the shallow wells, and then they also pull water out of the Floridan, which is a deep brackish water supply that requires reverse osmosis to clean it. They also have a very detailed and comprehensive water conservation program, and they're they're also one of the leaders in reclaimed water, where you take water directly, water that's going down the drain through our sewer systems, and it's cleansed and used for irrigation purposes on golf courses and medians and such.
Okay, thank you. Again, we will get to every question, and we will probably need to forward back the answers to you. So we appreciate your patience. They're great questions. We just need to keep moving. The next presentation is going to be one that talks about health advisories and water quality advisories, and it will be conducted by Jennifer Ross with the Lee County Health Department.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you for that. I know we don't have much time, so I'm going to touch very briefly on what we do with the health department regarding water quality issues. So a lot of this information we've already heard from the Marine Lab, but red tide is something we're interested, something that we track at the health department. You know, the main talking points is that we let them know is that swimming is safe for most people as long as the algae bloom is not on shore. There is possible skin effects from swimming in a red tide, but I think if most people saw an algae bloom, they wouldn't want to go swim in it anyway. The other thing that we want to have people remember is that if you're walking on the beach, you don't want to get cut by fish bones or shells. So we really encourage people to wear shoes and other protective equipment so they're not getting cuts on their skin. So red tide, again, we've heard about this, but high levels of red tide can bring respiratory issues. So you could have a chest cold, feels like you've got a tight chest, maybe your eyes are burning, your nose is burning, it's kind of hard to breathe. And unfortunately, there's not too much we can do about that. Like it was mentioned, red tide is patchy, and it's hard to predict exactly where people on shore might feel symptoms of red tide effects. So, you know, if you're starting to feel the symptoms, the best we can say is that you have to leave the beach area. Nothing else is really going to stop it unless you get away from it. So going inside where you have an AC unit, that will help filter out the air, closing your windows and doors so that the air from the outside is not coming into your house will definitely help. The issue is really with people with chronic respiratory conditions such as asthma or COPD or lung cancer. They really want to avoid the area because they're already having issues with their breathing, and so people with asthma might need to make sure their inhaler is with them. And again, the effects of red tide can extend for up to a mile inland from the beach, so it's really hard to pinpoint exactly where people might have symptoms. So the best advice is to go to the Visit Beaches website that Marine Lab hosts to see what effects are happening that day. And if somebody does start to feel ill, that they should just go ahead and go inside, and so their body can stop being exposed to the red tide. So at the health department, we do participate. We have, when there are blooms out there, there are weekly conference calls that happen with all of the partner agencies who are involved in this presentation and others, talking about the extent of the bloom, what direction it's heading in, what kind of effects people are seeing. We also monitor all local hospitals, urgent care centers, and poison control hotlines for people to determine if people are reporting health effects from red tide. If we see a really big increase in this, then we do release media alerts to the public to let them know that there are pretty serious health effects happening on the beach at that time. We don't post signs at the beach here in Lee County, again, because it's so patchy, it's difficult to determine each day what effects might be happening. But if we're noticing a long-term effects pretty much every day for a week, if we're seeing that people are reporting a lot of respiratory issues from the beach, then we probably will release a media alert to remind people of how they can protect themselves from red tide. So in addition to that, I know a lot of people are very concerned about the water quality in the beach water itself, especially with the releases from the lake. So it's important to remember that bacteria is always in the water. It's naturally occurring, and so not all bacteria is bad for you. So what we're really interested in is the bacteria that are going to make you sick. So in general, the water at the beach is pretty safe unless you're going to start swallowing it or allowing it to come into open wounds on your skin. If you have a cut from either a shell or from fishing, or if you just have another open scar on your body that you haven't had covered, getting that water that's contaminated with bacteria into your body could make you sick. It could give you a rash on your skin. It could cause some GI distress. So going into the ocean with open cuts and wounds can make you more likely to develop what we call Vibrio vulnificus, which was really in the media quite a bit last year because we did have some cases here in Florida. Luckily, this year it's been quite quiet. We haven't seen any locally acquired cases of Vibrio here in Lee County. But again, this is a bacteria that's naturally occurring in the Gulf water, and it's always going to be there. So we always encourage people that you should not go into the ocean if you have an open cut or wound on your body. It will allow that bacteria to get in. Most people are pretty fine. The concern is for people who have compromised immune systems. We don't want people who have cancer or other chronic diseases to be exposed to this bacteria because it could make them really sick. So again, always reminding people to not go into the water if you have open cuts. Don't eat raw seafood because it can be in shellfish as well. And if you start to feel ill, or if you notice that you get cut while you're swimming or fishing, and you start to notice that the infection is not healing, please seek medical care, because antibiotics can help with this infection, and it will make you make sure that you're not at risk for any more serious complications. So the Department of Health in Lee County does host the Healthy Beaches program here for this area. So we test 13 different beaches, both salt and brackish water, for what we call enterococci bacteria. So this bacteria is kind of a big family of bacteria, but basically we know that if there's a high level of that bacteria in the water, it could make you sick. It would, if you would accidentally swallow it, you might get some vomiting or diarrhea. That's something we want to avoid. So we do test the 13 saltwater beaches and then 2 freshwater beaches. The bacteria count is actually, the standards are set by the EPA, and so we follow those standards that are listed there. So the count standard for freshwater is also a little bit different than the one for saltwater, but we follow all of the EPA guidelines when we're testing the beaches. So under normal conditions, we do have signs out there that say no water quality advisory at this time. So we like to keep people aware that, that we haven't noticed any high levels of bacteria. When test results do exceed those EPA levels, we do post an advisory sign that recommends not swimming. And at the same time, we also distribute a press release to let people know that right now there's high levels of bacteria in the water, and we advise you to not go swimming because if you accidentally ingest the water, you might get sick. So far, we have not seen any correlation between the amount of water being released from Lake Okeechobee and the bacteria content at marine beaches. So we did see an initial high reading of bacteria at our freshwater beaches for 1 week, but we have not had to post any water advisories so far this past month for the beaches. So we're not really seeing any correlation between bacteria and the lake releases, which is a question we get a lot. The water looks dirty. Is it safe to swim in? Well, it might look dirty, but there's not a high level of bacteria in there. And if there were, we would post a sign at the beach to let you know. And that's my contact information.
Thank you, Jennifer. So we'll just go back to the question board quickly and see if we can. Okay, here's one. Based on the grades for bacteria in the water, what is our normal rating? Good, fair, poor, etc.
Our normal rating is good. We would post anything that was not considered good. So if something is posted, that means we didn't reach a good level. So we are typically in the good.
Okay, so another question for Jennifer is one of your suggestions that Lee County hospitality employees should make to our guests to wear shoes on the beach. Can you please clarify this?
Yeah, well, I mean, so we're not going to say that every time you go to the beach you have to wear shoes, can't go in the water, but it's just a good precaution if you're just going to be walking along the beach and that there's, as we see, there's shells, there's other broken, sharp objects, and so if you're just going to be taking a walk down the beach, we would recommend shoes so that you don't get cut. But again, of course, people are going to be barefoot in the water. So if somebody does get a cut on their foot walking along the beach or in the water, it's just really good to make sure that they know to clean out that cut, take care of it, put a Band-Aid on it, and if they notice they have an infection there, a day or two later, if it looks like the cut isn't healing, then they should really seek medical care and get antibiotics for that cut.
Okay, what causes the water to look dark?
I can cover that. So we refer to that as color dissolved organic matter, and that really is a fancy word for tannins and other organics that come from the watershed. So that actually influences the color of the water. While the color may be dark, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's toxic or harmful for people to be in. But a lot of times when we do see these really dark waters, they often are correlated with higher nutrient loads, which can fuel algae and other things. So just because it's dark doesn't necessarily mean it's unsafe to swim. But certainly you want to make sure that you check your health department advisories and make sure there's not high bacteria, because when we have high rainfall, sometimes we do get higher bacteria levels.
Okay, and that was James Evans. So he is our next presenter, and he is with the City of Sanibel. He's the Director of Natural Resources, and his presentation is going to be very useful to those of you that work along the beach, because there are sometimes odd-looking things on the beach that scare people, and they're actually very useful and important.
Great, thanks, Nancy. All right, so obviously I'm James Evans, Director of Natural Resources for the City of Sanibel, and I work with a lot of folks in the tourism industry on Sanibel, and we get a lot of questions on things washing up on the beach, and in particular, how water quality affects, people's ability to visit our beaches and enjoy our beaches. Obviously has a direct impact on our economy. So my discussion today is going to focus on what you may find on the beach and how it might impact your experience. So I just want to recognize our partners. We work very closely with Lee County Natural Resources in particular, and the BCB, and our other sister cities, the City of Cape Coral, the City of Fort Myers, City of Bonita Springs, Town of Fort Myers Beach, the Village of Estero, and some of our agencies on Sanibel, in particular the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Jane-Ding-Darling National Wildlife Refuge, and the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation are very important partners. And I'll be talking about some of this information today. So what influences the quality and conditions of our beaches in Southwest Florida? Phil touched on this a little bit. Weather really affects the conditions on our beaches. For example, wind, that can drive things that are normally on the bottom of the sea floor up onto our beaches, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Heavy rainfall can influence the appearance of our water. I mentioned earlier on that question that was just asked about the colored dissolved organic matter. High rainfall means that things that are in the soils and plants wash off the landscape and into the water, making that water appear darker. Water temperature can also influence what's going on our beaches. In the warmer months, we get blooms of an algae called trichodesmium that can give the water a golden color or look like there's sawdust floating on the water. So, all of those factors influence our beach conditions. And stormwater runoff locally or from the Coosatchee watershed can influence, what our water looks like. If it's turbid or stirred up, even runoff from Sanibel can affect the way our coastal waters look. But with these higher releases and discharges off the landscape in the Coosatchee Basin, we tend to see darker water. And I have this as a separate bullet, but the regulatory releases from Lake Okeechobee, they're also influenced by rainfall and weather patterns, because when we have high lake levels, we tend to see higher discharges from the lake. And then, of course, red tide can affect the conditions on our beaches. If we have a high concentration of red tide, we can tend to see dead fish or other things washing up on our beaches. So I just want to remind everybody that not everything that washes up on our beach is bad for tourism. In fact, Sanibel is known as the shell capital of North America, and things that wash up on our beaches actually attract people from all over the world to shell along our beaches and enjoy and find treasures along our beaches. You'll notice if you look waterward in this photo, you'll see some small amounts of red drift algae. That's normal, and I'll show you some photos later in this presentation that show some more abnormally high concentrations of red drift algae, which we should be concerned about. But in general, these are the things that happen after major wind events. This isn't out of the ordinary, generally associated with winter cold fronts. And again, these are important for the ecology of our beaches. And so what you might find in our rack line, you'll see algae and other organisms. And I want to just underscore the importance of these things that wash up on our beaches for some of the critters that use our beaches during the winter, and some of them, they're year-round residents. For example, the red knots that visit our beaches, they use our beaches to fuel up for their migration to South America and back and forth to the northern states. So it's important that we don't go out there and rake our beaches and destroy the habitat that they need. Yes, when we have a lot of detritus and things on the beaches that can in fact impact people's experience on the beaches, but remember, we have to share our beaches so that the organisms that people come here to see are here for everyone. So the function of a rack line, it starts with the primary dune. The rack line catches seeds and plants grow in the dune. That helps to secure the sands from erosion and also to give our beaches a natural appearance. They provide essential food for birds, fish, and crabs. Crabs are important food for a lot of the organisms that live along our beaches. And they provide vital nutrients to the dune plants that grow along our shoreline. And I also mentioned that small amounts of algae on the beaches are also good because those provide structure and habitat for a lot of the organisms that live and forage along our beaches. These are some of the common species of algae that show up on our beaches. Once in a while, we'll see large strandings of algae called sargassum. That's the one you'll see, and it looks yellow. It's kind of in the center of the picture. Those usually come from offshore and wash up on our beaches. You'll remember back in 2005 and 2006 and 2007, we saw some very large accumulations of red drift algae, which are most of the species up top. Those are the most common ones. Periodically, we also see green algae that wash up on our beaches. Some of the other organisms that we see, everything from those little worm-looking things on the left-hand side in the middle of the photo, those are called parchment worms, to, of course, the shells that people come to Sanibel and Fort Myers beaches to find. We also, after cold fronts, will see a lot of sea urchins and other organisms, like you see the colonial tunicates on the bottom. They look like kind of a slimy-looking mass. We call that sea pork. But those are things that normally would be found on the sea floor offshore, but are brought up onto the beach after major wind events. We had some concerns during the BP oil spill that we were seeing tar balls on our beaches and things like that. Just so everyone knows, we didn't see any tar balls washing up on the beaches of Southwest Florida. But at the same time, when all of that was going on, we were seeing a lot of tunicates, sea squirts, and other organisms that looked very similar to tar balls. And you'll notice here in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a picture of a tar ball, and on the left-hand side, you'll see a sea squirt. They look very different, but to the common beachgoer, they might be confusing. We also see other things like these, like the stingray egg cases and things like that that wash up in the rack line. Here's an example of difference between the tunicates and the tar balls. If you take a tar ball, or what you think is a tar ball, and you try to pull it apart and it's sticky and it sticks to your hands, and you need, petroleum products to get it off your hands, it's probably a tar ball. If it just smells like the sea and it doesn't pull apart, it's probably something that's probably more natural, like a sea squirt or a tunicate. Some of the other questions we get are, when is, are the jellyfish along our beaches harmful, and when do we commonly see the jellyfish? And I'll answer that later in the presentation. But some of the common jellyfish we see are the comb jellies or ctenophores. Those don't have stinging cells, so you don't really have to worry about those guys. The moon jellies located in the middle of the screen there, those aren't really, they have stinging cells, but they aren't that harmful. They're not going to be, if you swim through them, they're not going to be something that's going to hospitalize you. But we do have other jellyfish that if you do come in contact with them, they will hurt you, and you'll probably have to seek treatment. The sea nettle, those are one that if you swim through them, you'll probably want to, probably put your hand in warm water or whatever part of your body is contacted to try and reduce the pain that comes from those stinging cells. Pink meanie and the lion's mane also can produce a sting that's relatively painful. But again, most of these aren't going to hospitalize you. You just need to get out of contact with these and try to neutralize the sting. So a lot of times we get questions from hoteliers and other people in the tourism industry about the rack line and how much algae is on the beaches and things that people generally are concerned about. If you look at these different pictures, you'll notice that starting on the left-hand side, that's a moderate or a light rack line. That's normal. We're not going to go out there and clean up drift algae if it's light to moderate. It's when we get in these heavy or extreme accumulations that you see on the right-hand side where that can actually start to impact the ecology of the beach, where we'll start to look at beach cleanups and things like that. So which rack line is excessive? You'll notice here that the one on the left and the one on the right are very heavy, and we would consider those excessive. And the city of Fort Myers and likely the town of Fort Myers Beach would look at potentially doing some isolated cleanups or even widespread beach cleanups when we see strandings like this. We want to avoid cleanups as much as possible because every time we put equipment or people on the beach, it does impact the ecology of the beach, and it also impacts the enjoyment of the beachgoers. If you have heavy equipment going up and down the beach, it's pretty hard to sit in your beach chair and enjoy the peace and quiet of the beach. These are some photos that were taken in 2006. These were taken on Sanibel Island. You'll notice the high accumulation of red drift algae along the beaches. This was directly related to a really high nutrient loading event that occurred from releases from Lake Okeechobee, discharges and runoff from the Clusatchee watershed, and several other things that were kind of playing a part during this time, and that was a lot of the grazers and things that grazed down the algae were wiped out in the previous year by red tide events. So there are a lot of things that were playing a role that resulted in these large accumulations of drift algae on our beaches. At the same time we were seeing some of these drift algae events, we were also experiencing red tide. So a lot of people get confused between red drift algae and red tide. They're very different organisms. Red drift algae is a macroalgae, algae you can see with the naked eye, where the red tide is a microorganism that produces a neurotoxin, and that you generally don't see. It might change the tint color of the water, but generally you don't see it. You just feel the effects and see the dead fish. So why do we want to resist raking of our beaches? For one, you'll notice that red circle around a small little bird called a snowy plover. They're important critters that use our beaches during the spring nesting season. and we have about 10% of the Gulf Beach population of snowy plovers on Sanibel on some of the beaches of Lee County. So it's important, you know, if you're a normal beachgoer, you're not going to see that. And if we rake our beaches, you can imagine we would probably eliminate their habitat and impact those protected species. And again, we share the beach with others. You'll notice that little guy in the middle there, there's a small snowy plover. And again, if you go out there and indiscriminately rake the beaches, you can impact habitat for these important guys that attract people from all over the world that bird along our beaches to see and bring money to our local economy. And a lot of the algae is also used for commuting. Sea turtles use sargassum and other types of algae to harbor in to make their long trek along the seas so they can get big enough to come back and nest on our beaches. So I want to shift gears a little bit, and you know, I think some of the questions here and our frequently asked questions are going to be related to a number of the presenters here today. These are questions that we often field in the Natural Resources Department for Sanibel, and I'll touch on them, and if you guys want to chime in as we're going through them, they might answer some of the questions that were submitted earlier as well. And so why is the water along our beaches so dark? I touched on that earlier. That's that colored dissolved organic matter, or the tannins in the water that run off the landscape. While this can be natural, I think that the alteration of the system is part of what Phil talked about in the Central and Southern Florida project. We replumb the system so the water gets to the coast quicker, and so because it gets to the coast quicker without treatment, it tends to be darker in nature, and a lot of the soils that erode can come with that water and make it more turbid and dark looking. Is the water safe to swim in when the discharges are high? First of all, I think that we would want to check the health department website to make sure that the indicator bacteria, like the enterococci bacteria levels, aren't high. And in general, you know, just because it's dark doesn't mean it's unsafe to swim. So do you want to add to that? Anybody want to add to that?
I would agree. You know, like I said, we have not seen a correlation with high bacteria since the you know, darkening of the water and the discharges from the lake. We haven't seen high levels of bacteria to go along with that. So just checking that beach advisory, making sure that the water is, you know, have low bacteria levels should be sufficient.
Very good. So what beaches are not being impacted? And I think Tracy talked about this a little bit. You know, I think the reporting system that MODE has, and you know, I think it's excellent because it tells you, you know, what beaches are being impacted. And so we often field calls, you know, is all of Sanibel being impacted by the red tide event? Oftentimes it's patchy, especially this year. And there's a number of beaches that aren't being impacted by either red tide or the releases from Lake Okeechobee or watershed runoff. So, you know, give us a call in the Natural Resources Department. We can often make recommendation on what beaches, if not on Sanibel, which beaches in Lee County might be the best ones to visit. What's being done to stop the discharges? Well, you know, this system, you know, wasn't broken overnight, and unfortunately it's not going to be fixed overnight. So I think it's important that we all work with our legislators to get funding for important projects like Phil mentioned earlier, the Everglades restoration projects to store and treat that water and help move that water south where it's needed into Everglades National Park and Florida Bay. You know, but I think the best thing that people can do is get engaged, get involved, and you know, let your legislators know that you know, water quality is important to you and your business. And until the businesses really get engaged, which they have over the last several years, it's going to be tough to change and fund these multi-million, sometimes billion-dollar projects. What can I do to help stop the discharges? I think I covered that under you know, what's being done.
Can I make a statement real
yes,
quick? Just there is a plan in place, and a big part of it is Everglades restoration and the restoration strategies. And last year, the University of Florida produced a report. They looked specifically at lake releases and discharges and what can be done. And their number one recommendation was to fund and build those projects that are on the books out there. You know, the number 2 and 3 recommendations all dealt with land acquisition, buying lands for future projects. But first and foremost, they said let's build the projects that are on the books and get going. And that's where James comes forward here, saying that we do need that support to get Congress and the state legislature to move forward and fund those projects. So.
Great, thank you, Tom. So some other frequently asked questions, you know, is it safe to swim in the water? We talked about that a little bit earlier, and a lot of questions that we receive are related to bacteria levels. We will refer them to the health department's website. It's excellent, and it provides, you know, really good information on what beaches are being impacted by indicator bacteria. one of the other questions that we often receive is questions about Fleishinian bacteria. That's a common name for what they call Vibrio vulnificus, and that's a bacteria that's often found in shellfish, like oysters and other bivalves. And it's always present in the water. It's just whether or not you come into contact with it. And you know, as Jennifer indicated, you know, if you have open wounds and other you know, health immune deficiencies and things like that, you probably want to avoid areas, you know, where those bacteria are present. Jennifer, did you want to add anything?
I would say that was it. I mean, the flesh-eating bacteria is a bit of a misnomer. That's not actually how it works, but it's kind of gotten a little misconstrued in the media. The concern really is that you would, you know, cut yourself fishing or on a shell, walking on the beach, and that if not treated with antibiotics quickly, then the bacteria can get into your bloodstream and cause a really bad rash around where you were cut. That's why people call it flesh-eating bacteria. It doesn't really do that. The bigger concern is that you would get a bloodstream infection. So just making sure that, you know, if you do get cut and you notice that you have a bit of an infection on your skin, you should just get antibiotics as soon as possible.
Great, thanks. And so some of the other questions we have during certain times of the year, especially in the you know, transition between the spring and summer, you know, between May and June, you know, we'll see this sawdust-looking stuff on the water. And when that stuff washes into the bay and into our canals where it's more stagnant, you'll see that sawdust kind of morph into what looks almost like paint on the water. And that's a type of blue-green algae referred to as trichodesmium. That's one of the algae that Tracy talked about a little bit, and that's one of the ones that can fix nitrogen and potentially feed red tide or be a precursor to red tide. And so sometimes if you see that in your canals, you know, that's probably what it is. It's that blue-green algae that's kind of transitioning from one appearance to another. If we see creatures wash up on the beach, should we throw them back in the water? Well, yes. If they're alive, throw them back in the water. If they're dead, they're fair game for showing. So anyway, that's what we're generally telling people. You know, if you see a dolphin, sea turtle, manatee in distress or on the beach, you know, for sea turtle, we recommend that you call the Fish and Wildlife, the State Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and report that. Locally on Sanibel, you can report sea turtles to the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation or the city's police non-emergency number. And of course, in Lee County, there is no live shelling allowed. Stingray season, generally April to October, we often recommend doing a stingray shuffle. If you get stung by either a jellyfish or stingrays, especially a stingray, I would seek medical attention. Jellyfish, there's things that you can do to neutralize a sting, such as putting the affected area in hot water or vinegar or other things that can neutralize it. Dead fish on the beach, I think we've already covered that. Red tide, you know, that's been covered as well. And kind of leading into when and how we clean up the dead fish on the beaches. If we hit certain criteria that I'll discuss real quickly, the city of Sanibel will do beach cleanups. In Fort Myers Beach, I would recommend that you contact the town of Fort Myers Beach to find out what their cleanup policies are, but I'll touch quickly on the city's policies. Raking or removal of naturally occurring wrack on Sanibel is discouraged by the city and is specifically prohibited except in the case of red tides or other dangerous litter. In these two restrictive cases, the public health factor becomes paramount. So if we have large amounts of dead fish that produce bacteria and are harmful to the public's health, we will do cleanups. We'll also authorize the hoteliers and other managers along the condos and other places to do beach cleanups. But that, of course, is up to the city manager, and the city manager will make that call if it's warranted. We do need permits to remove things from the beach, so we will often seek the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's blessing to remove things from the beach or put equipment on the beach to remove things. Generally on Sanibel, we try to avoid putting any equipment on the beach. For our red tide policy, generally accumulations of 100 fish per 100 feet of shoreline or 1 fish per foot will warrant a beach cleanup, especially at our public beach accesses. And with that, I just want to go ahead and wrap up and just remind everybody that it's not just the the sport fishing, it's not just all of the other things that we come to Florida for, but it's also protecting the wildlife and the environment that we all live here to enjoy. Why we should protect it.
Thank you, James. Okay, we're just going to take a quick look. There is a couple questions for James. Is there anything the hospitality industry as a whole can do to help lessen these events?
So if you're talking about the events, if you're talking about discharges from Lake Okeechobee and the runoff from the Caloosahatchee watershed, well, I think like Phil talked about, completing the Everglades restoration projects and making sure that we have enough storage, treatment, and conveyance south so that we can move that water south instead of into the coastal estuaries. Again, reaching out to your local elected officials or your elected officials in Tallahassee or in Washington, D.C., and making sure that they know that this has an economic impact and that your voices need to be heard.
Many of our guests are asking where they can show monetary support for solutions. Where should we direct them?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure where to send your money to, but well, the best thing is support to the legislature and your local officials, and they then in turn can get some funding, and certainly some of the other agencies receive funding from the legislature as well. So you have concerns for these sort of things, let them know, and perhaps they can provide some funding.
And we can always use support at our nonprofit Marine Laboratory. We run completely on donations and grants, so any kind of help that we can get, our monitoring is limited to funding that we have, and that's why, a lot of questions that probably could have been answered by now might not, because we can't do our full monitoring like we would like to.
Okay, so we know there are questions we did not get to. As we promised, we will get answers to all of them and forward them back to all of you that participated today. I want to thank Dr. Fanara, James Evans, Phil Flood, and Jennifer Ross for participating with us today. The Tourist Development Council is committed to supporting your work as frontline tourism employees. Please refer to the LeeVCB website for a list of resources, fact sheets. You can even download some of them to share with your employees and your guests. And again, the rest of this slide that's up right now provides you with a variety of other links, information on red tide, where to go to look at the beach conditions reporting system. There are 9 locations now in Lee County, including Gasparilla Island, and we have some of you are reporting for MOTE in that beach condition system, so we thank you for that. And of course, South Florida Water Management, there's lots of information that Phil didn't share, but there's links to quick facts that you can turn to if you would like. So we thank you. We appreciate everything you do. On behalf of the Tourist Development Council, Commissioner Mann, do you have any words?
Let me just say 2 takeaways that I've picked up on here this morning from the best experts that we have in Southwest Florida and professionals that know what they're talking about. And I've written these down, and I've picked up on who said them. Jennifer, thank you for saying you have found no correlation between releases and the test results that you're doing daily in 15 different locations. No correlation between the recent releases that were necessitated because of the 12 inches unusual rain events. And I've also heard you say there is no risk from bathing in the brown water or the dark water, which primarily comes from the tannins. Did I understand that correctly? But there's no risk in the bathing, and there's no connection between the releases and the test results of the Lee County Health Department and Florida Health Department with whom we partner. And Dr. Fanara, I hope I understood you correctly when I wrote down there is no connection between red tide and Caloosahatchee releases of late.
None that we've seen yet. We have not, done testing or monitoring from this past event, but
well, the point in asking that and clarifying it, I did write that correctly. You haven't seen it at this point.
Right.
Because why we have this tourism group here together listening as our audience, is because from all the media reports, you would think there was threats to human health out there and reasons for tourists not to come here. Everything I've heard here this morning says there's no relationship between human threat or health threats between these most recent releases and the color of the water. And Lee County is still a very fine place to come to and enjoy the beaches and the waters. That's my takeaway, and I am profoundly grateful for y'all's participation today.
And thank you all who participated via your webinar. Please remember that it will be available. We'll post it to the partner site, levycb.com. We will alert you when that happens, and we encourage you to share it with your coworkers. Thank you all, and have a great day.